Okay, so here we start step 2. Step 2 is where we find our critical values. And to do that, we need to first find our degrees of freedom. So I'm going to calculate out the degrees of freedom and then the critical value, and then I'll start plugging those values in to an ANOVA summary table, which is really useful for organizing our information, especially when it starts to spread out across a couple of pages. So our degrees of freedom total is equal to big N minus 1. Now, if you recall, going back here to the first page, the big N was 80. Okay? So 80 minus 1 is 79. The degrees of freedom within is big N minus K, where K is the number of cells that we have. So it's 80 minus 4, which is 76. If we go back here to see the number of cells, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 cells. That's where K is coming from. Our degrees of freedom hunger is equal to the number of levels of that variable minus 1. So the degrees of freedom of hunger, we have 2 levels of hunger, empty and full, minus 1. So the degrees of freedom for hunger is 1. The degrees of freedom for weight, we have 2 weights, normal and obese. So 2 minus 1 equals 1. The degrees of freedom for the interaction, which is hunger cross weight, is equal to the degrees of freedom between minus the degrees of freedom hunger minus the degrees of freedom weight. And now we see that I forgot to calculate degrees of freedom between, so I'm going to skip down a few lines and do that now. So the degrees of freedom between is equal to the number of cells, or the number K, minus 1. For minus 1, it's equal to 3. Alternatively, you could take your degrees of freedom total minus your degrees of freedom within, and you would get the same answer. So you could instead do dF total minus dF within. That would get 79 minus 76, which is still 3. Which is a good check that we've done things correctly. So I'm going to pull this number up here. So the degrees of freedom for the interaction is equal to 3 minus 1 minus 1. So it's equal to 1. If I then look at the critical values, I'm going to put that down here. F critical. My degrees of freedom are 1, 76. The closest value in my table is, so the closest is 1, 70. So I'm always rounding down. Even though 76 is closer to 80, I'm going to round down to 70 to be more conservative. With an alpha of 0.05, my F critical is equal to 3.98. And now this F critical is for all three of the tests, the main effect of hunger, the main effect of weight, and the interaction, because the degrees of freedom are all the same. It is completely possible that you're going to have multiple critical values if you have different numbers of levels of your variables. So if you had 3 levels of one of your variables, you would have a different degree of freedom. So if you have, say, perhaps 3 levels of weight. If you had underweight, normal, and overweight, then you'd have 3 levels, and your degrees of freedom for weight would be 2. And so you'd have to look up a different F critical value for that. That's not the case here, but you would have to accommodate that. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up my ANOVA summary table. And so the way that I'm going to do that, I'm going to have source. And under source, I'm going to have between. I'm going to have within. And I'm going to have total. That's what we had in chapter 12, when we just had one variable in our ANOVA. Now that we have multiple, we're going to have under the between, I'm going to have weight, hunger, and the interaction of weight by hunger. My other columns are the same as they were before. I'm going to have sum of squares, and I'm going to have a value for each of these. I'm going to have my degrees of freedom. I'm going to have my mean square. And I'm going to have my F values. What I've calculated for those degrees of freedom, I can plug in. So my degrees of freedom total was 79. My degrees of freedom within was 76. From that, I was able to calculate my degrees of freedom between, which was 3. And then I calculated my degrees of freedom for weight, for hunger, and for that interaction. And so I'm going to start color coding. So the degrees of freedom are going to be in pink. And so if we come back here, the degrees of freedom just so that you can track it. I'm not going to highlight this one because I highlighted here and they're the same. All right, so that's where those numbers are coming from, is from this page.